A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, hello everybody. We're here with Mathew Staunton, a PhD originally from Northern Dublin, Ireland. He's a historian, publisher, printmaker, currently teaching and supervising research in the printed image department of the École des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, France. His main research interests on the aesthetics of Irish nationalism and the historiography of child maltreatment on the island of Ireland. And notice I didn't say anything about video games in there. And this is part of what makes it so interesting, right? For several years, he's been working with artists, musicians, and academics to develop an experimental historiographical practice that promotes a healthy public discussion of child maltreatment. And we're here to talk about the game that he's been working on child maltreatment. Mathew Staunton, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Matthew, let's jump into it. You're a historian, and you're making a game about child abuse. Those two things seem really far apart. How did you get to the point where you're designing this game?
As you can imagine, child abuse is a difficult subject to talk about in public. It's a difficult subject to keep people focused on, because their first instinct is to go away and get out of the room and go and see if there's a better talk going on in the next room. And very quickly, when I started to talk about the history of child maltreatment at conferences, I realized that it was very difficult to connect with people if I was doing something that was purely historical, looking at data, looking at archives. I started trying to connect more with people and to talk about my own experiences, what I'd seen in school, what I'd seen as a child in Dublin, and to try to make a connection and to provoke an emotional response rather than an intellectual response. And I was in a few conferences where I was with colleagues who were doing something a little bit more academic, and the people in the audience were in associations of survivors of maltreatment. And they didn't connect at all with the academic approach. They switched off. And when I tried to do something a little bit more, it was a little bit awkward. It was a little bit clumsy at the beginning because I didn't know I didn't have the structures to do that. They connected immediately. So I started to look for things that made me feel something. And I came across Brenda Romero and the Mechanic is the Message series that she did. And I never managed to play any of the games because with those games there's one copy of each. But the idea got me all excited that something could happen in a game that could completely turn your stomach upside down and make you rethink what you're doing, or put you in a position where you have to make a moral decision that's absolutely repugnant. And it's the closest I think you can get without doing something that is actually repugnant to experiencing something of some of these things we look at in history. With Brenda Romero, she has a game on the colonization of Ireland, which is quite emotional as a subject for Irish people. She has a game about the putting people in trains during the Holocaust to go to the death camps, and a game about exploiting migrant workers in restaurants. So some very different subjects, but there's an emotional impact. And I said, well, that is something that I could potentially do. And I had also come across a game that you probably know very well, this War of Mine, the Polish game.
Yep, sure, yeah.
I mean, it's had such a huge impact, I think, on the landscape of game design, and it's. I mean, they've put it on the curriculum in Poland now in the schools. It's
really.
Yeah, I think it's the first video game that's ever been put on the reading list in secondary school context.
That's amazing.
And I went back to it while I was thinking about coming on to your podcast, and I hadn't played it for a while because it's a devastating game to play.
Yeah.
And they've added a DLC, and it's with children, and I hadn't
Right.
noticed that going through. And it's even worse now because you have
Oh.
a child to look after, and when you leave the house, your child is by herself in the house, and you come back and the child is there on the floor. The house has been broken into. You've just had to hit a priest with a shovel. You're devastated because you've been doing horrible things to get food for your child. Your child's had to face burglars. It's not a game that you could describe as fun or entertaining or it makes you feel something. And there's the game element of the challenge, of the strategy. Apparently you can win it. I've never gotten through. All my people always get killed.
I've read that of the millions who played it, 2 or 3 finished it. That they
Yeah.
intentionally made it very, very hard to win because essentially they were like, it's extremely difficult to survive, and they wanted to convey the tragedy even more.
Yeah.
I love that. I love all these influences, and that Brenda Romero is, launching all these other people into doing things like this is really great. Speaking of this War of Mine, because when I heard that you were making a game about child abuse, I was like, has anybody else made a game about child abuse? It seems like a rich topic, right? So I Googled it, and the first 2 things I ran into were old games where you got to beat up kids. And,
Good Lord.
that was the idea, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming that that's not what you have in mind, right?
No.
But, those games were supposed to be fun, and I think it's easy to get how beating up on kids in a video game might be fun to some people in a comic sense.
Right.
Right?
Edgelordy kind of, shock comedy.
Sure, right. But whether or not you think that sounds like your kind of fun, you can see how these people thought it might be fun. A serious game about child abuse like this War of Mine is not about fun.
No.
And, I mean, don't we play games for fun, right? I mean, what specifically were you trying to get the player to understand or to get from a game like this if fun is not the objective? Now, mind you, me and Andy kind of talk differently about this. Andy says, well, there's different types of fun.
Right.
And I don't think fun is the right way to talk about a game like this War of Mine. But you take it any way you want to take it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think some people think it's fun to jump off buildings and base jump with a parachute, and that's the opposite of fun as far as I'm concerned, or to go on a roller coaster. I mean, and people, I think when they go and see a horror film, they're doing something that there's an hour and a half, 2 hours where they can experience something that they can't experience in real life, and I don't think that's fun, but it's a moment where you can have some form of, you can release something, or you can be provoked into thinking.
I've come to realize that catharsis is one of the things on my lists of different kinds of fun, and catharsis is really important.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's what I'm aiming for to a certain extent with this game. But sort of more inspired by Brenda Romero, I'm looking to get people to see the system, to see the mechanics in real life of how abuse takes place, but also how nothing is done about it, which has always been the enormous problem I've had with the historical approach to maltreatment and abuse, is that it's happening pretty much in the open. We know that neighbors are beating their kids. We know the kids are going to school with bruises and whatever, but nothing is being done. And I wanted to, as a historian and as a designer of this particular game, to try to understand why the child is not being protected, and to make the mechanic of the game force the player to understand. And what I've sort of come up with is the notion that we have, is the problem with, and America, the United States, all of the British colonies share this problem. The common law is not really an ethical framework when it comes to children and women and the household. It's a defense when you get to court for beating your children. The common law defense is that it was educational. I was disciplining my child. It's not an ethical framework. It's what happens after you've gone too far and you're trying to explain yourself. There is no real ethical framework for how we not a one that's based in law, in how we treat our children in the house. We have, because a lot of people would argue that you can't really force people to love each other with laws and rules and to look after each other. This is expected as human beings. Our family connections are supposed to.
They're supposed to be loving. They're supposed to be protective. They're supposed to be,
So we're not supposed to be beating our children, but when we do, there's an enormous amount of flexibility in the law. The lines are very blurry, and we can go to court if we ever get to court and say, well, I was trying to discipline my child, but I went too far. So overzealousness in something that was legitimate and valid and legally acceptable, like the notion of repetitive use of legitimate force, which was a defense used. It's a defense used by the military, that if we're allowed to beat this guy once, if we beat him too much and he dies, then it's just we've gone too far with something that was legitimate in the first place. And we have, and that's a common law defense. And so there's a very, very vague and flexible ethical framework. And inside that, it's really only the individual moral codes of individual people that stops children from getting beaten regularly. How I feel about my children. When I'm at home, nobody's looking in the window and telling me not to beat my children. It's how I feel about this. And up until very, very recently, it was very difficult for anybody from outside the household to do something to protect children. Most of the common law jurisdictions, like the United States, like Ireland, like the United Kingdom, the government leaves us to do as we please in our house. And unless it spills out into the street and it's very spectacular, unless children die, unless there are 200 witnesses, nothing happens. So I wanted with the game to show how difficult it was for a child who was being beaten at home, for this fact to become known and for something to be done about it. In the game, the beating is relentless in the sense that it's going to happen. It's not something that might happen. Children are being beaten. And the objective of the game is to keep this from becoming a problem with the courts, with the law, with the police. So the player plays as the parent, and they have to do everything in their power to make sure that it doesn't go as far as the courts. There's no details about how the beatings take place. It's a very simple mechanic. But the idea is that the first of all, you have to be witnesses. You go to the doctor or you go to the hospital. There are files. Historically, in the UK, in Ireland, we had serious problems with the lack of communication between hospitals, between doctors and hospitals, between all of the different actors. Some children who eventually died had been seen by 100 different people, but none of them were in contact. And I think this is a problem in the United States. If you go from state to state, they don't necessarily communicate certain files between Ireland and the UK. So
that's right.
I wanted to show that it's very difficult for the child. There's no real child protection historically in the system. What we have is a limit which is easy to go over. And the currency in the game is reputation, is power. It's a mix of power, reputation, social status, money. I have a cube for that. There's a value for that. And that's the other currency is injuries to the child. And you can use your power and your reputation to diminish the visibility of the bruises, of the injuries. So when you get to the end, you have a stack of cubes of tokens that represent your power, and you have a stack of tokens that represent the injuries to the child. And if you have more power than there are injuries, then you win that case, or the case is dismissed and you go back. But you're losing reputation as you go along. The files stay in the hospital. So what I want people to do is to look at how power works and how the injuries of a child can be explained away if you're powerful enough, if you have a reputation, which means that there's a class element to it too. Somebody who's got plenty of money, who's got power, I don't know if you've seen the new Irish film, The Banshees of Inisherin.
It's a lot of my friends have seen it, but I haven't seen it yet. It's getting a lot of really great reviews here.
I won't spoil it for you, but there is a policeman who represents, if you like, he's the most powerful person on the island because he has, and he's not a particularly good person. So I won't spoil it for you, but it does explore that idea that somebody with power can get away with a lot, especially if that person is supposedly the person who's supposed to check if you're doing something bad or not.
It sounds fascinating. So the game is basically a kind of a single player game.
Yeah, I think so.
A parent who is beating their child against the system, and so the game doesn't have you actually beat the child. The child beating is just going to continue relentlessly.
Here you are. You set out to design a game that helps people understand domestic violence against children, one specific form of child abuse, which is also interesting because you're choosing that versus child abuse in some sort of larger way, or because even if you're mainly focused on violence, there's also other related dynamics, right? That can be explored. So it's interesting. It's like you're making a creative decision there as you're trying to figure out what's going to be the scope here. I'm assuming that in designing a game like this, you face some special design and some special moral challenges, and I'm really curious at what were some of the challenges that you recognized or encountered in the early stages when you were thinking about making a game like this?
I think the very first challenge I had was to avoid making it look like the child had done something to justify or invite being beaten. That it would be, or to make it look like the parent was justified and should be having their case dismissed, to find a way to not blame the victim. I think the idea that I came up with to get around that problem, because it's very easy to, in court cases, that the main defense was that this child was cheeky or this child was difficult and his brother's fine, his brother didn't get beaten, and the character of the child is very often, even today, is destroyed in court to justify what the parent has done. Mm-hmm. And so there was some research done in the 90s where they, for the very first time, they asked children in the UK about being hit, about being beaten at home. And it was revolutionary because these were very young children, and it's very difficult to get access to young children and ask them questions like that. The parents are never going to say, well, fire away, ask my children about how they get beaten. And they managed to get a small group of children, and they asked them, and they at one point they made a mistake in their questions, and they asked the children, where do you get beaten? And it was a fairly ambiguous question. They wanted to know where on the body, but the children all understood it as where in the house or where. And they got incredible information about where these things were happening, and they were always in the same sorts of places. In at the supermarket till, at the in the bathroom where the child was having a bath, at bedtime when the child was going to bed, at the dinner table, at places where there was already a certain amount of tension and stress and time constraints, which were the triggers. And I think it's safe to talk about triggers in relation to violence against children because it doesn't blame the child. There are moments, contexts where adults are more stressed, and somebody who has a propensity for violence at these. And so what I did was I connected up for each day of the week. There's a place or context. There's a parent who has a certain level of stress, and there's a child who rubs parents up the wrong way, or doesn't, or is likely to create a problem in a particular location. And the idea is that it's impossible to get through a week without something happening if the parent has this propensity for violence and is overstressed. So the challenge was how not to make it look like the child was at fault, but also thematically to connect up to something in the real world. The idea of locations that are stressful, or that places where things happen, and also the indoors and outdoors aspect, because people do beat their children outdoors, but not so much because they don't want to be seen, and they're capable of controlling it up to a certain point. So there are people who are a little bit more sneaky about it. So to have this mechanic where some people can lose it outdoors and they're witnesses, and some people they do it more indoors. So to show that somebody who's being sneaky to that extent, that's nothing to do with the child and their how provocative they are, whatever, and to but also, I mean, maybe an even a bigger challenge was to make it not boring.
Right.
Where if it's relentless, how what can you do to? Where's the game element that the child is accumulating bruises, the parent is perhaps losing reputation, but eventually we get to a point where there's a court case and the parent. So where's the game element? And that's where I brought in the exchange, the currency of power versus bruises, and with some sort of events that happen where there are things that can eliminate the risk or things that can exaggerate the risk. It's not something you can win, but like this war of mine, the objective is not to win. For me, the objective is to feel something.
Right. I want to go back to how important it is, for you to make this game, interesting and enjoyable in some sense. And I'm using the word enjoyable in the sense that the wider sense Andy was talking about.
Yeah, a better word might be engaging.
Engaging.
That's a good word.
Compelling, or, all right, because I mean, the whole point of this is you want to take this issue and you want people to think about this issue. You want people to be aware of this issue, and they're not going to do that if the game's not going to be compelling.
I'm interested in diving into a little bit about the kinds of agency that you're giving your players. So what are the kind of choices that they make?
They have a certain amount of, I talked about the context locations. So I imagine that they would have, it would be a week that they would have 7 specific moments in the week where they could lose their cool and beat the child. And at the beginning, you get more than 7, and you can eliminate 1 or 2 to reduce it to 7. So perhaps flash moments that would be particularly provocative can be thrown out, or moments where you would be seen. So when we played it with Michelle, what we tended to get rid of were the public contexts, so as to reduce the risk of being seen. And then you can reorganize the week and place maybe some events which are less provocative after the more provocative ones, so you can have a highs and lows. You could perhaps regain some of your composure, because one of the mechanics is around the idea of the breaking point, where you lose your cool, and you can gain it back if you go to places which are, for this particular character, more relaxing, or you can go to bed and regain 1 or 2. So there are moments the agency is in not trying to avoid hitting your child, but trying to avoid getting caught.
Right.
So to avoid the more spectacular scenarios.
So you're it sounds like you're kind of managing your own temper to a degree.
To a degree, yeah.
Right.
Avoiding the more difficult situations. And I think I'd like to develop that a little bit further, and maybe when you get to the end, perhaps go back and try to play it with an extra card, or to be able to create a new mechanic to see. And I think the one of the main reason I want to make this game is to discover something that I wouldn't discover by just reading archives of events like this. And I think one of the things that I have discovered is that even though we're not blaming the child, it's clear that the parents need help, medical help, psychological therapy, maybe psychiatric help. That it's something that if we had to go back in time, you could send an army of therapists in there and maybe avoid a lot of.
Right. Do you think that your game might be useful as a tool of therapy, a therapy tool to let people who are abusive see how they're being triggered, and see how they're and be able to see the systems that are working in themselves?
I have seen some of the moments where I lose my cool while playing the game. I've recognized something about myself. My wife has seen some of those moments as well. I think yes, it is. Even if it's just a tiny glimpse of something, I think it's helpful. It's useful. I mean, there is a game I think produced in Sheffield University in the UK, and it's for social workers it's about domestic violence, but it's like a race game where at certain points you face there's a scenario where you have to apply the protocols of social work to that. it's not, you don't learn anything about the actual perpetrator of the violence. And it's not a game for potential perpetrators, it's a game for social workers. And I think it's difficult to admit, but I think I can see the potential for me losing my cool in some of these scenarios, because I have two ways that you can lose your cool. There's stress and there's anger, an anger that has nothing to do with the actual with the time of the day or the what's going on in work, but you have these two elements that can push you over a line. And I've been pushed over lines by stress, not to the extent that I've hit my children or hit anybody, but I can imagine that there are people, I can see, I have colleagues who have been pushed over lines into all sorts of horrible behavior. It happens. And I think it's an opportunity to have a discussion. One of the main things that I want to happen with a game like this is that a discussion like this, you might have somebody say, well, that reminds me of that thing I did, or that reminds me of me, or that reminds me of my dad, or that, without sort of pointing fingers and getting on the phone to the police, but to begin to see that maybe I do have a problem with anger or stress. If that is something that could emerge from a game like this, then I think it's a massive positive.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's great, this idea, and I have so many questions I want to go back to, Matthew. I'm going to pepper you in a minute. But I think it's really great to think of a lot of these games as essentially just jumping points for starting conversations. I mean, that's really kind of the idea. The thing I'm always thinking about is, where are you going to get people to think about it? How are people going to think about it? But and I want to talk about that with you. But before we do, the game Detroit Becomes Human. It had some scene with domestic violence against a girl by an angry dad who was strongly objected to by some child welfare advocates. Right? They essentially saw the scene, and in the scene, you're the robot, because Detroit Becomes Human. You're a robot. And you're the domestic robot who's supposed to be there with the child, and you're watching the abuse, though you could also be an ally and save the child. Child welfare advocates asked Sony to remove the scenes or to pull the whole game because of this. They were concerned that the scene would be enjoyed by people who engage in domestic violence against children. I know, Andy, that the skeptical look on your face, I had that skeptical look too. I was like, really? I mean, they make the guy, I mean, in that game, the abusive father is clearly the bad guy.
Yeah.
But they were still worried that some people would enjoy being the bad guy. And they were worried that this would promote norms that say that violence against kids is okay.
Right. So normalize. They're worried about normalizing violence against children, which is something that I wonder about, Matthew. It's a generational thing. There's a generational element of this, right? There's a generational element where our grandparents spent more time, hitting their children than we do now.
And a cultural element.
Element.
Though the Detroit Becomes Human case, they were really worried about people being tantalized.
Yeah.
To me, this went really too far. At the same time, though, your game, as far as I understand it, I mean, you're trying to help the parent get away with child abuse by giving the system. Does that seem to be potentially supportive of child abuse itself in terms of the norms? Now, I know that's not what you're trying to do.
There's an argument that you might be training people on how to get away with child abuse.
I mean, I would hope, and I would be ready to defend that position, that depending on how I call the game and how I describe the game, that it would be clear, and I would make it clear that it was about child protection. And one of the problems with child protection is that there isn't enough child protection in the system, built into the system. What's built into the system is a willingness to listen to the excuses and listen to the legal defenses. And there's a willingness on the part of lawyers, no offense to any lawyers who are listening, but that the defense lawyer in a case where someone is accused of child abuse is there to find all of the loopholes and all of the excuses and all of the legal defenses that are possible. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And my game is about that. Where are the loopholes, and how do we address them?
Matthew,
That's-
it reminds me of a game. I forgot what it's called right now, but it's Cambridge made it about fake news. I think it was about fake news. And in that game, you are essentially tasked with your purpose is to try to use fake news to essentially increase your followers, increase your influence, and they teach you the ways that's done in order for you to be aware of the ways that's done, right? So it's similar in that way, but it also seems to pose that kind of challenge because my students would say when I had them play this game, "Hey, aren't you teaching us to manipulate social media?" Right? Isn't it? And it's interesting as the game designer, how it is that someone walks this line. I mean, your goal seems a really valuable one.
It's
right?
kind of a literacy aspect, right? It's like
Right.
once we become aware of how things are done, then we can not only know how to do it, but we also see it when other people are doing it. Right. I have another question for you. You brought up basically the legal system, and I wonder if you've roped in a defense lawyer in part of your game design process.
There is a lawyer, and if you have enough power left by the time you end up in court, you can pay. Pay the lawyer. You mean in real life?
In real life, yeah, as part of your
No,
process for designing the game.
No, not yet. I had when I lived in England. I lived in England for 6 years. I accidentally bumped into some lawyers who were defending defending the police in a case of there was a paedophile ring, and the police were also they were sort of on trial for failure to act in a particular case, and they were talking to me about and their defense was, and they were openly taught that these children were no angels, that this was their line in court was that these children, we have to take a look at what these children were like, that the police couldn't do anything if the children were speaking out and getting themselves into situations, and I was pretty shocked at this line, but this is what they're paid to do. For me, we're looking at a situation where there's a sort of a moral void inside the house, and in society in general. The void is it's less of a void, but there's still a void there, and there's a lot of flexibility in how we argue. And obviously, somebody who's trained and paid to make these arguments, like a defense lawyer, in a situation like that, is going to have all the arguments at their disposal, and it's going to be very difficult where the child isn't listened to, the child's voice. And in this game, the child has no voice. I think nobody asked the child, what happened? What we have is the parent. Now, yes, we're beginning to. It's just been written into the Irish Constitution that the children have a voice, which is, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've begun to see children being asked what they think of situations which impact on their health or on their lives in general. But that's a very, very new thing, and it's a new thing in general in the world where we ask children what they think. Sure. How do you feel about this thing that impacts on? Usually, we ask the parents or one of the other actors who have an impact on their lives, like doctors or psychologists or teachers or any of these adults. But we very rarely, historically, ask the child. And I think the defense lawyer is a person looking at actual cases going back a century in Ireland for throughout the 20th century. You have on one side the defense lawyer with the parent, with the teacher, because we have one of the problems with the common law is that all of the powers, the authority of parents is transferred over to teachers. They have exactly the same power to hit children, and there were often cases where you had teachers or parents plus a defense lawyer, and on the other side you would have the doctor and the child, and the doctor would talk about the bruises, would talk about what it was usually a he at the time. I'd seen the judge was always a he. Most of the people in the court were on both sides were going to be men, And the child's voice was never heard. It was the defense lawyer was finding reasons for why the child was hit, including the child was difficult to manage. The doctor was saying, well, I found bruises here. I can't say where they came from, but maybe it was a bicycle accident, or maybe it was and there was a discourse being created around these events by all of the adults. And I think that's what I want to draw attention to in the game as well, is that there are files being transferred, there's information being transferred. The defense lawyer is going to try to create a narrative that's helpful. And in the end, what it amounts to is if you have enough power or money or reputation, and you have a lawyer that you can pay, you're generally going to win at least once in a court case. Mm-hmm. The second time, the judge is going to say, "Hold on, I saw you before. You have a history," and you've got the situation, unfortunate situation, which you also have in the United States, overworked professionals in all of these areas, in the hospitals, in the police force, in the criminal justice system, who they may have seen a dossier go before their eyes at some stage, but they're not necessarily going to remember that it's the same guy, or they're not. There's so much stuff going on that it's very difficult to keep an eye on. And if people move around, if they go to different hospitals, I mean, there's a very famous case in England that they use in training social workers and training people in child protection. I had to do that training because I was teaching art to some children, and I had to do a very basic level of child protection training. Mm-hmm. And there was a child who was, I think, killed in the end. But this child had seen 100 different professionals in social work in hospitals, and but none of them were communicating with each other. So they didn't know that this child was in danger. And the one person who had seen the child more than once and who eventually reported them was a taxi driver, because the parents had used the same taxi driver several times. And he had his own personal moral code meant that he had to go and tell somebody about it, whereas the doctors were too busy. I'm not saying that they don't have any moral code, but they just, I mean,
swamped.
If you have they're swamped, and doctors and nurses are doing 3 days nonstop. And I mean, I'm sure if you have doctors in your family, they'll tell you that story about the lack of sleep. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with this game as well, is to draw attention to the weaknesses in the system.
And you know, Matthew, I think this is part of what's really interesting. What the parts that I didn't expect, not knowing about your game, right? I assumed a lot of it would be essentially focusing on the evils of the parents who are doing this, but I like that it's not making this about the bad parent, which is not to say that you're not a bad parent if you're doing, if you're committing violence against your children, but that the parents themselves are embedded in a system, and that there's also cultural backgrounds to this. I want to move from that to kind of whenever you're looking at serious games like this, right? The first and obvious thing that we think about are, you don't want to miseducate anybody on your subject, right? And I'm wondering if this is kind of, if the black and white picture was one of those things you don't want to miseducate about. What were the particular things that you were maybe concerned about? I want to make sure that I get this right.
That's an extremely good question. I think it's a key question. I think I mentioned it earlier, the idea that the child is at fault in some way. When I played through the first time, even as somebody who had made the game and somebody who has children and somebody who's studied, I thought, wow, I'm making it look like this child is triggering something, and it's the child that's the problem. It's not the system. So I had to fix that. I think that there are children who will rub people up the wrong way, who are of a particular personality. I know children, you put me in a room with these children, I'm going to get stressed. I'm not going to hit them, but my stress levels will go up. I think that's not what I'm trying to say, that this is what leads to violence. I think violence is something that is misunderstood in general. I think we have a very black and white vision of what violence is because of cinema, because of literature, because of the way we talk about it. And I think that's something I wanted I had to be careful with the idea that I have cubes that go on the card for the child, that they don't just disappear, that bruises go away, and that everything is okay again. That there's a deeper psychological damage that's building at the same time. I mean, you know about the Kemp and the battered child syndrome that was discovered in inverted commas in the 60s, because of X-rays. We knew that children were being hurt in the past, but we hadn't got data because we weren't able to check until they were unfortunately dead, and we could look in post-mortem. And so the ability to see or the inability to see them is what causes a lot of the violence against children. They're not going to be beaten in public as much as they are at home or in private spaces. I wanted to make it clear that the violence isn't something that's completely irrational and uncontrollable, because a lot of people are able to control it in public spaces, and they have a reputation for being a good dad or a good mum or a good parent in general, and but when they're at home, they're horrible to their children. So I wanted to try to find some nuance in the relationships, and avoid the black and white. Even though it's a very simple, there's not a lot of mechanics in the game. It's quite black and white, but I think what's not said, and hopefully this is what you take away from the game, is something that stays in your mind afterwards and that you think about. And that's the thing I look for in a game, rather than fun. It never ends. It's still going on in my head afterwards, and I'm thinking about what I should have done. How could I have fixed that? How could I have survived? Should I have done something else? Or that's a terrible thing. I hate the fact that this is happening in this game. And some of my best gaming experiences are moments where I can remember games from 30 years ago where something happened that really upset me, and the games that were just fun, entertaining, I've completely forgotten about.
We talked about the miseducation aspect. The other big thing with these things is, as a designer, you have responsibilities to your stakeholders. And your big stakeholders here are kids and their parents, right? Are setting out to do this. Did you see yourself as having any obligations to parents or the children while making this game?
For sure. I mentioned earlier that I had the experience of giving a talk to a room full of people who were in associations of maltreatment survivors.
Right.
And talking to a group like that, you have an obligation not to trigger them, not to start showing pictures of dead children. And unfortunately, at one of the talks, that there was somebody else who was actually a coroner, and he was used to giving talks to his peers, and he showed photographs of dead children to a room full of people who were in associations fighting against child abuse, and there was a horrific noise from the crowd all at the same time, a sort of a groan. So I think a big concern would be not to trigger people who have suffered violence, that this shouldn't be something where they go, oh my God, this is exactly what happened to me. And that I'm not sure for the moment that I have successfully addressed. 20 years ago, we weren't considering, the idea of triggering people wasn't a concern in academia. And now it certainly is, and we do try to avoid it. But I think this is a subject which is especially triggering. If you talk about something something happening in a bedroom, something happening in a bathroom, something is happening in a car. I mean, think about all the films you've seen where things are happening in bedrooms or bathrooms or cars or on public transport, in train stations. But at the same time, I think, I can be careful and warn people that this is what the game is about.
I think you're wise to focus it on the parent, and not on the experience of the child. What you're talking about is the experience of the parent.
Yeah.
And so I think that helps you in that regard.
I think it's just a fascinating challenge. We had an episode where we talked about trigger warnings, but the potential for trigger warnings, when trigger warnings were needed, were for things like suicide in the game or anything like that. But here you have a game that's really different from the ones we were thinking about, where, your very subject matter is serious. And this is, by the way, where I think potentially, getting input from a child welfare advocate on this might be, because obviously you're trying to do something good and something very, very helpful and something that will have an impact on people while trying to walk this line. I think it's a very tricky kind of situation. I want to move you now back to this to the second thing you talked about. By the way, when you were talking about these games that made you think, it really reminded me of when I played This War of Mine. I played it in the morning, and I remember I spent the entire day thinking about a single decision I made in the game. And I felt guilty about it. I thought, what does this say about me as a person? And I loved it. I thought it was one of the most interesting moments I've ever had in a game. And part of what I think is interesting about anybody who sets out to make a game like this is, how do you create those things, right? How do you create these sort of situations that, that gets you to think about it, right? Because it's, you can't just tell the players that, something like child abuse is wrong, right? I mean, that's preachy, and it doesn't develop any understanding on their part. They're like, of course it's wrong, but, that's not really the point, right? On the other hand, you don't want them to be apathetic about the issue, right? I mean, you want them to play the issue and walk away thinking and really caring about it. And you want them to you want them to explore, right, different facets of this issue. So what kind of techniques did you use in this game to kind of get the player to think? Because your goal is for the player to walk away really thinking about this.
I'm very interested in narrative in games. My dream is to have a game that has just one card or one tile and weeks of narrative where you construct something around hardly anything at all. And I think, I don't know if you've come across a game designer called Everest Pipkin, who makes narrative games. And they have a book that's just come out I think it's called The End of the World Game. And it's a series of epilogues for any game that you play. So there's one, for example, where you have to go back in and fix everything that you did during the game you've just played. You have to put everything back in place. If you've done a heist, you have to put all the money back. If you've blown up a building, you have to rebuild. So it sends you back in with all the knowledge that you have from having played the game, but with a completely different objective, to fix the things or to write the history of what you've just done. And I think I'm interested in the idea of an epilogue, something where you have to do some writing or some thinking or some discussion or there's a thing that you have to do. Maybe go back in and add a card that changes something, to create a new rule or to create a new mechanic or to move something, so that you have to see. It means that you have to be aware of how the game is working and the mechanic of how the parent is protected by the legal system, and then what would you fix? How would you change it? And that's what I'm aiming for, is an epilogue where you have to go back and manipulate something or fix something.
That's really interesting. Yeah, Andy, do you know of games that do that? Of an epilogue type? It's interesting, this idea of an epilogue type thing. I've never heard of it.
No, but I do know that our industry has recently, and I say recently, like 10 years, 15 years now, have become aware of just how important it is to have a denouement. That a game has, like, so frequently, prior to 15 years ago, every single game ended at the moment, like the climax happens, the big battle is won and over. Right. But that's actually not very satisfying. There's actually a lot more satisfaction to be had if you give players this time to sort of breathe and understand what has happened in the game. That there's this emotional importance to having this denouement time where things become easy and you have this sort of time to absorb what the game has been trying to tell you. And so an epilogue is sort of, I think, falls into that category of, like, give players time to, like, think about what happened in this game, and having some sort of specific action where you're forced to think about what's happened in the game. It's just a great idea.
Matthew, so this is, we never said explicitly, but this is a board game, right?
Yeah. Well, for now, I mean, it's got fairly simple elements. It could be a game for telephone, or it could be fairly easily converted into a video game.
Obviously, there's different techniques, different capacities, different things you could do with a board game and a video game. And I'm curious if you've thought of any ways, any advantages in terms of getting people to think, or any techniques about getting people to think about this that might apply if you were turning this into a video game.
For the moment, I don't have any flavor text on any of the cards, or there's no booklet with introductions. I think that's going to be extremely important to frame the game in a particular culture. So not in the present, because in the present we have a fairly well developed social services sector in most Anglo-Saxon countries. But in for example, 1950s Ireland, there were no social workers. The church managed the hospitals and managed foster care, and they were quite happy with the level of domestic violence that was going on. But so that the flavor text would be important, and that's something that would transfer very easily over to a video game. I don't know if you know the game Never Alone. It's about an Inuit a child and a fox, and in that game they've included. It was made with Inuit spokespeople and associations, and they contributed a lot of cultural elements. There's texts that explain all of the cultural artifacts in the game and the mythology behind them, and the Inuit language is heavily included in the game. And I think that's something that would work with this sort of game. Is the voice of the child could be included in there could be voice acting for explaining certain elements. Again, you'd have to be extremely careful. Now, it would be very difficult not to make that triggering. I mean, but I think you would need to have a certain amount of. I mean, I'm working in an art and design school, so I'm already thinking about the visual aspect, and I've sort of got some very angry looking adults and some very fragile looking children already. So I think that's something that could be developed in a video game, is the visual aspect, and something that I haven't talked about very much. I've hinted at it, is the spatial aspect. I'm playing with cards, but I'm creating a space, a zone, the inside, the outside. A lot of the research that I've done into maltreatment is related to space. What happens in places where there's no window, where the door is closed, where we're indoors, outdoors, underground. So all of the things that you could imagine in a horror film apply to this situation as well. So I mean, that would be very triggering. Again, if you did it like a horror game, you did it. But the spatial aspect is extremely important, and that's something that you can simulate in a very minimalist sort of way with cards on a table. But you could do it in a much more powerful and provocative way with a video game to show space. So I'm not a programmer, and I'm not, but I do have, people around me who would be able to make a fairly simple game, video game out of this. But I want to get it right as a board game first. I've made a few other simple board games which have really helped me to understand the subject. The ones that I've played with people, and the result was I learned something from making the game, and then. But this is the main reason I've made this game, is so I can learn something. The fact that it's going to be playable with other people, and then I'll see their reactions and hopefully learn something from them as well. The games I've already made, I had one where it's just like it's like Snap or War, where you're just putting cards down, and you have doors, windows, keys, and you're opening and closing doors, opening and closing windows. And if you can line up the open door with a passerby, and then you play an eyewitness card, the maltreatment has been seen. And it's very difficult to do that because there's only one eyewitness card. And I played it with the idea was that there would be only one door and one window that could open or close. And I played it with a hardcore gamer, and he started putting windows and doors in all the he was putting. So eventually we had 5-6 doors, 5-6 windows, and he won. And that is the solution to the problem of children not being seen in rooms, is to have more windows. And that's what in Irish schools now, the ultimate solution that they found that actually worked was to put a glass viewing panel in all of the doors in every room in a school, so that people could see in. And that's something that we consider normal now, is to have a lot of glass in a school once we have children. But it wasn't. Architects until the 1970s didn't ever imagine that this was an issue. And you had a very famous architect, urban planner in America called Oscar Newman. You might not have heard of him. He came up with the idea of defensible space, where if we see it, there's a space over there where somebody's being attacked. If we don't consider that that's space where we're not responsible for that space, we don't go and help the person. And this was something, I think, which happened. He developed this idea after an incident in New York where a person was attacked in an alleyway, and 50 people saw the incident, but nobody did anything. And he said, okay, well, the problem is not just that people are reluctant to call the police, it's that there's a problem with this alleyway. And he looked at it from the point of view of an architect. What's the problem? The problem is that we don't consider that it's our business. It's none of our business. So how do we make it our business? And I think that's something you can explore with a video game as well. The notion of line of sight, which is not so easy to do in a board game, where you're lining things up. It's a lot easier to do in a video game, where seeing things makes it your problem, or being seen makes you a problem for somebody else.
Wow, that's really interesting. All right, Matthew. This was just fascinating. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
What I've experienced in this conversation is that this is a subject that is inclusive and universal, using games to experience some of the more difficult aspects of our lives. I think this is something that I would invite your listeners and invite anybody to try to do themselves, to imagine a game, imagine a shared experience where they can push the limits of their knowledge and understanding of difficult situations a little bit further.
All right. Yeah, well said. All right, Mathew Staunton, thank you so much for coming on our show.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.